Hello, this is Ron from Bethel Church here in Dixon, Illinois, and we are studying different names of God. And this is week number 7 on our online class. And as you can see up here on the board, today's name is Elroy, which means the God who sees. We are going to be in the book of Genesis once again. In fact, we're going to be in the same chapter that we were in last week with El Shaddai. We're going to be looking at a different perspective of it this way because we have a different name of God, so it is a different revelation of his characteristics. Before we get into any of it, I do have a question I'm going to ask you. And what is the first thing that you think of when I mention the person's name, Hagar? You're thinking, okay, she was in last week's lesson with El Shaddai. That was Sarah's Egyptian maidservant that Abraham slept with and had a baby with. And so that was a big act of disobedience. You are correct. That is who Hagar is. And we are going to be looking at her as the main character, other than God, in this scenario because, believe it or not, she is the one that gives God this name. And we're going to be looking at the story from her perspective because it's a lot different looking from her eyes than it is from maybe the way we've read it before. So Elroy is the God who sees. I don't think there's any issue with people not thinking about God sees everything. Just throw a few verses out here like Hebrews 4:13. Nothing in all of creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. And then a little over 400 some years after Genesis that we're going to be looking at, if you remember, God's people, the Israelites, were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt, and they were crying out to God, and God remembered his covenant. And in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, here we see that God is talking and says, I have indeed seen the misery. I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. And so we are going to do a little background before we get into the name Elroy, and it's going to be some of the same background that we looked at with El Shaddai in Genesis chapter 12. When God calls Abram, and if you remember the story, it was just last week, God made 3 promises to Abram. Number 1 was, I will make you into a great nation. In other words, the Israelites did not exist at this time. There was no such thing as a Jew. And so God was going to start a whole new nation that didn't exist before, and it was going to start with Abraham's son. Secondly, a second promise God had given him in Genesis 12 was, to your descendants I will give this land. It was the land of Canaan. And so, again, there we have the promised land. And the third promise in Genesis 12, which affects all of us, was that in you, in Abraham, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. In other words, Jesus was coming from the Jewish race, the Messiah that is going to save everybody, potentially, that surrenders their life to him, will be blessed through the line of Abraham, the Jewish line. Now, last week with El Shaddai, we kind of jumped to Genesis 15 where God made the covenant. And what we want to do today is we're going to stick around here in Genesis 12 if you have your Bibles there, because there's a little bit more to the story here of, well, where did Hagar even come from? Well, we see that, and if we continue here in Genesis chapter 12, there was a famine in the land, so Abram went to Egypt. Now, if you remember from one of our earlier videos, way back when, Egypt was a picture, or it is a representation of the world, the non-Christian world, that the New Testament talks about all the time. Well, Egypt was a picture of that. And so, you know how we always try to get our needs met from the world instead of from God? Well, Abraham, or Abram at the time, goes down to Egypt to get what he needs. And when we see verse 16, we see what he gets. He acquired sheep, cattle, donkeys, both male and female donkeys, men servants, and maid servants. And so we can see that Hagar came from when Abram and Sarah went down to Egypt to get some belongings. Now we can go to Genesis chapter 16, and you know the story that we looked at last week, and that is Abraham and Sarah are trying to have a baby, and it's just not happening, even though it was God's promise that, he's going to make them into a great nation. And Sarah comes up with this idea. Chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, at the time it wasn't Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservants. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And then we get to verse 3. After Abram had lived 10 years in Canaan, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Now remember from last week with El Shaddai, at this point in time, Abram is like 85 years old, so Sarah is like 75. And obviously Hagar is a lot younger because she can bear children. Here she has the baby. Let's go to verses 5 and 6. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering." Say that again. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." And then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Now, we read just a lot there for once. Let's go back and think about this for a moment. Again, let's look at it from Hagar's perspective. How do you think she's feeling at this moment? I mean, whose idea was it that she had to sleep with this 85-year-old man? I don't think, that's, high on her list, but she's in a maidservant role, in a sense. I mean, it says it right there. And so she's just following orders. And so how do you think she's feeling about this whole thing? It said, when she got pregnant, she started despising Sarai. And, then Sarai gets mad at her. And so here we have Hagar in a male-dominated world. She's pregnant, she's alone, she's being rejected, she's being cast out. Think what's going through her mind. We often look at her as, she's the reason. I don't know if you followed this or not, but Isaac, when Sarah finally has Isaac 14 years later, the Jewish race comes through him, but Ishmael comes from Hagar, and that's where the Islamic race comes from. And so there we have both of those races coming from Abram. And we can see here that it's easy to look down on Hagar because, that's where, if we're looking at, that's where that Islamic race came from. But she was really the victim in this whole thing. If you're looking at it from her perspective, she didn't have a choice in the matter. And she gets pregnant, and then the lady that, Sarah, who thought about this whole thing, kicks her out of the camp, her and her baby. And so think about that whole scenario. We haven't even got to the name of God yet, Elroy. But we're just thinking about it from Hagar's perspective for a change. And so let's continue with the story. Let's go to verses 7 through 9, and we're going to see a character that we've seen before. It's called the angel of the Lord. If you remember from previous videos, when we see the word the angel, or the angel instead of an angel, we're talking about an Old Testament theophany, which is an appearance of Jesus. You remember the angel of the Lord, or the Lord, Yahweh, or Jehovah, is often used interchangeably, and we'll see that here in a few minutes. But that is, again, an Old Testament appearance of Jesus. And so here we have verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." Verses 10. The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. Some interesting prophecy here going on about, if you're thinking about maybe the hostility that still today is happening between the Jewish race and the Islamic race. Well, it all started right here with Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac won't be born yet for another 14 years. But here we have Jesus, the angel of the Lord, telling Hagar, go back to her and submit to her. Then we have verse 13 and 14. She, that's Hagar, she gave this name to the Lord. There we see it's not the angel of the Lord, but it's actually Yahweh or Jehovah. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are Elroy, the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Berlei Roy, the well of the living one who sees me. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. And so there we have that name of God, and it comes from Hagar, believe it or not. And I think that's pretty cool because it's one of those things like, does God see when I'm being mistreated? Or does God see when you're being mistreated? Well, yes, he does. And obviously, he also sees when we are the ones that are doing the mistreating also. But in this scenario, and it's what we want to look at, we often have this temptation to get back at people because they've been mistreating us. And here we see in 2 Thessalonians 1:6 that God is just. He will pay back trouble to those who trouble you and give relief to you who are troubled. And as hard as it can be, we are supposed to let God do the payback. Actually, in Romans 12, Paul puts it this way. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, says the Lord. And so, sometimes we want things done right away. It's not often in our timetable that things get done, but it is in God's timetable. And he is just. And everything will be made right eventually. But we are supposed to allow him to do that and not take our vengeance on people. It's like, I'm going to get you because you got me. And, you don't find that in the New Testament. And so God sees us all the time. Obviously, he sees us when we're sinning at times too. All the time when we're sinning. There's a couple of verses here in Proverbs 5:21. A man's ways are in full view of the Lord. He examines all his paths. In Jeremiah 23, verse 24, as God's talking here, he says, can a man hide himself in hiding places so I do not see him? Declares the Lord. Do I not fill the heavens and the earth? Declares the Lord. And so God is the God who sees. He sees when we are being mistreated. He sees the wrong of everything. And it says he is just and he will make the things right. When Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount about prayer, and in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus tells us, don't be like the hypocrites out there that pray, long prayers loud so everybody can hear them and see them. He says, go into a closet all by yourself. And he says this, close the door and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And he says the same thing about fasting, do it in secret. The Father who sees what is done in secret will reward us. And so Elroy is the God who sees. Now let's take it to the New Testament with Jesus, because Jesus sees also. And I just want to share this story here because it's one of my favorite New Testament stories. When we're going through troubled times, we call it going through storms. And here we have a perfect example of that. Here Jesus in Mark chapter 6, he just fed the 5,000, that one miracle where, he had just a couple loaves of bread and a fish. and he feeds 5,000 men, not counting the women and children who were there. And then we see this in Mark 6:45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Now, later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. And he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Now, you have to picture this. This is a very cool scene. The disciples are out in the middle of a lake, and here it says Jesus sees them straining at the oars. And if you want to know how far away they were, the same story is in John chapter 6. John 6:16, you can read it. It was dark, and the disciples were 3 or 4 miles away. And so here we see Jesus seeing them straining. I mean, you have to, that's signifying that he can see the grimace on their faces from 3 to 4 miles away in the dark. And so, yeah, Jesus sees us in our storms. There's another story where Jesus was asleep in a boat during a storm, and they wake him up, and they're like, "Don't you care if we're all going to die?" And he gets up and calms the waves. In that story, Jesus was in the boat with the disciples. Here's a different story where Jesus is not in the boat on another storm, but he's seeing everything that happens, and he still comes to the rescue, because if you continue reading in the story, this is the one where he's walking on water, and he jumps in the boat with them after he catches up with them, and he's almost going to pass them by. So again, Jesus sees what's going on in our lives, and he is the answer. He is the answer. There's nothing that is unseen by God. We can't hide anything from him. God sees when we are being mistreated. And as hard as it is to not react, God says, I'm the one that's going to pay back. It is mine to avenge, says the Lord. And so there we have Elroy, the God who sees. I hope you maybe have a different perspective of Hagar in the story, because it's pretty cool. She, basically really the victim in that story, but I just find it awesome that she is the one that gave God the name Elroy. And again, we'll just continue on with this series. I will see you next week with a new name of God. And until then, may God bless you, and keep studying the Word. In Jesus.